Hello class, and welcome to another foundational lecture of 4401. Today we are going to be going over both articles that were assigned this week, so I would probably suggest that you pause this or come back to it later and finish the readings because we will be going over some concepts that I think really you should be getting out of the material, essentially. On that note, take a few seconds, maybe pause this lecture to look at the cartoon here and sort of think about what you think it is trying to convey. On the left here, we have a woman in a bikini, or at least a biological female presenting, that says, "Everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." In seeming contrast to this, you have a woman in a full veil or burqa saying, "Nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." Think about that and what it is trying to say about ethnocentric understandings of what it means to be, let's say, oppressed. This is not something that is universal in terms of how people understand oppression, especially in terms of gender power relations. It should be said, of course, that there is such thing as the patriarchy, and it is pervasive, but the patriarchy looks very different in some aspects, even visibly, as you're seeing in this cartoon potentially, concerning how it is manifested and understood at the cultural level. And again, this is a cultural anthropology class primarily, even for those that are non-anthropology majors, which is the majority of you. This is a capstone class, and it tries to sort of give you, not a crash course necessarily, but a foundation in which for you to understand what it means to live in a cross-cultural, multicultural society that has different understandings and perceptions that are fueled by historic contexts as well as contemporaneous situations. So throughout this lecture, there are going to be a few instances where I'm going to have you pause and watch a short clip or video. So I'm keeping that in mind when I'm thinking about how long this presentation is. So more or less, you should have about the same, if not a shorter lecture than you had last week, which I'm sure you'd probably be thankful for. But let's dive right in. If this was a live, either virtual or physical classroom setting, I would ask these questions. For the anthropology major in the classrooms, I think there's only one. You probably are very familiar with this article, and for the rest of you, you may not be. So maybe think about it for a second. We'll do it Blue's Clues style, essentially, of me asking you, what culture is this? You would probably say the Nacirema if you didn't catch on quickly. But maybe pause this video and think about what Nacirema is backwards. There you go. So yes, it is American. This is talking about American culture, but intentionally obfuscating that by changing the name and also describing cultural practices that we take for granted and don't really think about. They're unspoken as somehow exotic, essentially. So when it's talking about going to the holy mouth men, it's not talking about going to, let's say, a shaman. It's talking about going to the dentist, and how there is a ritual process behind almost everything that we do. So for instance, when you wake up, presumably you go to the bathroom, you open your medicine cabinet, which is literally what it's called, and pulling out your toothpaste or toothbrush, going through the ritual of the morning of brushing your teeth, of taking a shower, of eating breakfast, and drinking your coffee, maybe. This is a ritual. A ritual doesn't mean necessarily that you're sitting down at an altar and you're praying towards something to an anthropologist. A ritual is just basically repetitive practice that we just get used to doing that has a purpose, at least in terms of what we think about what that means. So for instance, there is nothing that is necessarily telling you to brush your teeth in the morning beyond that it's an expectation that you have, or at least you think others have of you in terms of personal hygiene. But you have the agency, for instance, to not brush your teeth in the morning. That ritual, repetitive practice and the unspoken reasons for doing so is what anthropologists really like to hone in on and say, okay, why are they doing this? What purpose does this serve in the larger cultural context? What shaped this practice over time? But this article is also saying, which gets to the second question here, what is the point of this? that anthropology in its history largely talked about sort of mundane practices from other cultures in this very exoticized manner that essentially othered them, made them seem exotic or more tribalistic or savage than they really are. So, taking some classic examples in anthropology, for instance, we would talk about going into a exotic tribe in the Amazon and seeing that these individuals drill holes in their teeth to ward away demons or to extract the spirits that are infecting them. In another term, they would basically just be practicing dental hygiene, essentially. But there is different cultural meaning and understandings of spirits of disease that shape their understanding of the world around them. This othering of other cultures has also been termed creating the noble savage, basically saying, for instance, that Native Americans or indigenous individuals are somehow more closer to nature than we are. They have a greater bond and that they are more real to the human experience and condition. This essentially others these individuals and, in a sense, puts them below you because you're saying that we are society, we are civilization, and they are the other. They are savage, they are closer to the land, essentially. This is rooted in the racism in the United States, which we'll get into throughout this class, but also elsewhere in the globe, you'll see similar contexts as well. But, as the author says, it is to be hoped that when a thorough study of the Nacirema, see American, is made, there will be a careful inquiry into the personality structure of these people. Basically, what this article is trying to say is you also can study Americans or individuals in the United States the same way that anthropology has traditionally studied other cultures. We need to be cognizant of how we other different cultures just because they seem exotic to us. But in making something exotic, you make it other than yourself, essentially. You are the norm, essentially. This is what I'm trying to say and what this article is trying to convey, despite it being published around 70 years ago at this point. So if you want to sort of see an example of that, the video I have here gives a good sort of somewhat cringy, somewhat interesting take on what the article is talking about with some real-world examples, essentially. So I got ahead of myself with talking about the first bullet, but again, think about this in terms of how we conceptualize, I keep saying other, and it kind of makes the other when I'm saying that, cultures. Think about National Geographic, for instance. They have a long history of exoticizing and making of individuals as the other. On that note, they actually, I think 2 years ago now, had put out a statement basically apologizing for this long history of both colonialism that they sort of promoted, as well as how they framed individuals and made them the other. I mentioned National Geographic, and I poked fun of them for this essentially because I also had received grants from them, so I feel like I have some capacity to speak from the insider perspective as well, to do my ethnographic anthropological research in the country of Belize. Well, to be honest, to sort of sell a research project to National Geographic, you need to talk about the individuals, your population of choice in terms of the other, essentially. It's baked into the application. You must talk about how your research involves indigenous populations, that sort of thing. And actually, the language I would use in this grant was indigenous. They kept saying that as a buzzword at the advice of my advisor at the time, because she knew how this process worked, having also gotten someone else with this application. So anthropology actually has a long history of also promoting colonialism. It has been accused of, in its history, as a handmaiden to colonialism, basically meaning that we have helped instigate and promote it over time. Now, anthropology, in a more contemporaneous point of view, has done a better job of critiquing its history and saying that, for instance, we do have a sordid past with colonialism. And because of that, anthropology has become a very reflexive, critical discipline, not only of itself, but also how other researchers and scholars and disciplines talk about individuals. and also how the average individual essentially in a culture talks about other cultures as well. So, in a sense, like the Nacirema article, anthropology today tries to, quote, make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, end quote. This is a very sort of lauded phrase in anthropology that you would hear probably in every introductory anthropology class, which basically means that, like how the Nacirema does it, we do really weird things all the time in the United States. However, it's unspoken to us. It's not weird to us, but from an outsider perspective, looking in, they may think what we're doing is very strange and very odd. We obsess about personal beauty standards. We obsess about individualism almost to the point of the detriment to the larger population. These are qualities that some would consider to be very negative about the United States. Some consider them to be a positive. It's based on your understanding of the world around you, essentially. And additionally, on top of that, we in anthropology now, at least largely, try to do this to make the strange familiar. And by that, we mean we're trying to de-exoticize cultures, essentially, in an attempt to say, hey, we're just all humans. We have a different upbringing. We have different cultural practices and understandings about the world. But nothing is inherently more strange about one practice in terms of another, because again, it is historically mediated and understood as something that you just do, essentially. Now, anthropology has a long history of exoticizing the other, but we do it on a daily basis. Think about how, for instance, news organizations talk about the Middle East as an example, to pull from Abu Lughod. There's nothing inherently exotic or savage or other or uncivilized about practices outside of this country, despite this pervasive thought that we are the pinnacle of civilization in the United States. I think concerning how we are approaching COVID-19, I would say that there's a lot of very good examples of how this is certainly not the case in terms of our healthcare system in the United States, but that's a different discussion. We'll talk about medical anthropology later on in the semester, with the caveat that I am a medical anthropologist, so I'm going to be bringing it in a lot anyways, but of hyper-focus later on in the semester. So you may be frustrated by this, but one thing that I'm trying to convey here is that anthropology has a real hard time trying to come to consensus towards one singular definition, really, of anything, even a central concept to the discipline like ethnocentrism. So that being said, I am providing here two interrelated but also a little different definitions depending on the scale in which you're looking at versions of ethnocentrism. In terms of the broader definition, I have the belief that your own culture is the more correct or developed compared to other cultures. This, I think, is quite evident in the US because there is a sort of assumption baked into how we think about living in the United States and being an American that basically implies that we are the penultimate civilization culture. We have this magical thing called democracy, and we should spread it to others because it is the superior form of governance. We have personal liberties. We have freedom of speech. But in some instances, this isn't necessarily the case, and these are not always good things depending on the context in which you're looking at. At least some individuals may have that perception. What I'm really trying to get here is that there is really no correct cultural practice, but when you think that you are always on the right side, by definition, everything else is against that or is beneath that, is different to that perception. Different things work for different cultures. That basically is the gist of what it means to take a cultural relativist perspective. Things are different. That doesn't necessarily mean they are worse or better. It's just different. In terms of the specific, judging the practices and ideals of another culture as less correct or developed than your own culture. So the broader one says, okay, we are always in the right. We are superior because of X, Y, and Z. Now, think about specific as in, okay, if that's the case, their practices must be less correct than ours because we are perfect. There's nothing wrong with our culture. This is how you should do things. You can think about this in terms of something as simple as the food we eat, the music we listen to, the language we speak. I'll get into this in the linguistics section of the class, but as an example, there is also a pervasive assumption in the US that you should speak English because we are an English-speaking nation. That concept of us being an English-speaking nation really does not translate into our history. We've always been a sort of melting pot, if you want to use that term, nation before we even were a nation. There were Dutch speakers, there were individuals that were speaking basically a variety of different languages that were mixing together. So this sort of false narrative that we have that everyone just inherently spoke English and this is how we should do and speak today doesn't really reflect our history, but it is a linguistic language ideology that we have that has shaped how we understand and think about the world, which has implications for policy. So for instance, that you should speak English in public schools, for instance, and classes should be taught in English, despite some individuals coming from other countries that may be more familiar with their native tongue, essentially. And now think about what that might mean in terms of their education over time. They're already at a disadvantage because they are not able to be instructed to in the language that they are most familiar with and grew up with. Related to this, I want you to pause this YouTube video and go to this link. Watch it. It's only about 5 minutes long, but you see what it really means to undergo culture shock when these individuals come to the US and experience a very different way of living their life. Additionally, think about some examples from this video, including when the man's on the airplane and trying to figure out, okay, what is American food or airline food, essentially. Additionally, think about towards the end of the video when we're talking about an instance that, in my mind, is very clearly embedded in racism for individuals that haven't grown up understanding what the racial history in our country has looked like. I mentioned food, and I think that it is really important to return to it because food as a cultural construct, basically what we consider to be food, is shaped by our history and our mixing with other cultures and civilizations throughout time. So some examples are things such as fusion food, where it mixes, as an example, Mediterranean food with East Asian food, and what kind of new cultural constructs we can create over time that some may become accepted and ingratiated and embedded within a new culture, and some may be rejected outright. So I'm going to pose a question here before you watch these videos. Well, video really. The other one is a short sort of link, but before you go to the second link, I want you to watch the video here, but also ask this question to yourself. If someone offered you a cockroach on a stick, would you eat it? As a follow-up, as I'm assuming you would probably say no, why would you say no? Think about that question as you are watching the first video here. This series is called Idiot Abroad, and basically it is a sort of comedy travel show where an individual who is notoriously very ethnocentric and introverted is sort of deshunted in a new, very quote-unquote exotic location, and just seeing the antics he gets into and basically his very curmudgeon, very, very British understanding of what it means to eat other people's foods and to experience other sort of exotic, supposedly, experiences, essentially. So watch that video. And if you have time, I recommend watching the series. It used to be on Netflix, but I think it is now gone. And then when you're done with that, I want you to go to the second link here. And when you do that, realize that despite you having probably an aversion to eating insects, we do it all the time. There are food standards that say, for instance, there can be so many bug parts or bug eggs per liter or ounce of a certain type of food. So we eat bugs all the time. Is it really that weird that people just do it more explicitly than we do? The anthropology of food, since we're on this subject, is a really growing and diverse field of anthropology. For good reason, I think, because food is something that we all partake in our different respective cultures. And the food we eat is very much embedded and grounded within our history and our understanding of the world, essentially. So, going a little further, we have a term here called food creolization, which you really can also expand to other cultural practices in terms of new ideals that are introduced into a given society. So, for food creolization, we're going to define this as blending different aspects of cultures together to create a product that is more acceptable or palatable, in terms of food literally, to one of the cultures. So McDonald's and other fast food restaurants that are entering the globalized market are very good at trying to creolize their food. Think of Creole culture as a mixture of different cultural aspects together to make one product. This is how anthropologists see new foods entering a society as an example. So to list a few here, McDonald's at the global level does not just serve chicken nuggets and cheeseburgers. For instance, if you take France, you can get deluxe potatoes, essentially, which are potato wedges, which I would love if I ever went to McDonald's. I'd rather prefer that than their French fries. But additionally, in Italy, they offer brioches, and in New Zealand, they offer the loaded lettuce, which is, I think, looks pretty tasty to me, honestly. But the moral of the story is when one culture meets another, there's going to be some exchange of ideals. That could be religious practices, it could be the foods we eat, it could be the languages that we speak. For instance, English is stealing words all the time. The majority of the English language is basically borrowing other languages and terms that we didn't really have a word for and making it our own, essentially. So again, it's funny that individuals say that we should speak English in the US when English itself is reflective of the diversity of multicultural perspectives that have developed the language over time, both in European context and elsewhere, but also especially in the United States. Additionally, some other very common examples of food creolization are, for instance, General Tso's chicken, a very sugary, very fast foody form of supposedly traditional Chinese cooking. Some individuals say that the term traditional itself is a false it's a false name, essentially. It's a misnomer because food is inherently diverse at the individual level, at the communal level, at the neighborhood level, at the level of the state, at the level of the country. So there really is no one food, and that one food, if there even is such a thing, can look very different depending on which area of a country, for instance, you are looking at. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that cultural artifacts, again, a term anthropology likes to say, are not universal. And mixing of cultural ideals and understandings happens on a daily basis at the global level. Something that happens in the United States can quickly get exported elsewhere. We can see this with, for instance, wearing jeans. In Brazil, a lot of individuals wear jeans. A lot of individuals utilize supposedly American or the products from the United States because there is a status symbol about having such items in some instances. And in a sense, we are exporting goods and services, which are cultural artifacts, which then become ingratiated within and embedded within other cultures. However, some things are easier to stick than others. And my own example, where I think I was being a bad anthropologist, basically, is when I went to the Universidad de Costa Rica, the University of Costa Rica. And there, they were trying to experiment with ways to introduce eating insects as a protein source, which is very cheap and very nutritious, into the wider audience, by making them more palatable. Well, how they decided to make eating insects more palatable at the university is they were giving out basically free samples of chocolate-covered insects. They were free. I could have freely just walked up and got one. However, because of my aversion to eating insects, despite my knowledge that I do it all the time, basically accidentally when we're eating other products, I refused or did not go over to consume one of these chocolate-covered insects. I say I was being a bad anthropologist because there is this pervasive notion in the discipline that you should try to ingratiate yourself, embed yourself in other cultural practices and ideals so that you have a better understanding of going about operating within a certain culture, basically. This is not to say that people in Costa Rica are pervasively eating insects either, but the experiment they were trying to do is find ways that we can combine eating this nutrition source that people have an aversion to with something that people have a very vested interest in, chocolate as an example, to sort of introduce as a cultural sort of creolized practice of eating insects over time. For instance, if this became something that Americans loved to do, they started eating insects that were covered in chocolate, they may be more inclined to eat insects in other sort of contexts, including, for instance, in the Chinese example on the previous slide, of eating it on a stick, like at a wet market, for instance. Basically, cultures are diverse, they're shaped by our history, and they interact all the time, especially with globalization, basically forcing us to interact with each other on an unprecedented scale, essentially. So we talked about ethnocentrism, we talked about how cultural practices and ideals can be introduced into a certain society. But I want to hammer in how culture really is learned, both in terms of your development as a child into adolescence, into adulthood, but also in terms of you, for instance, going into a new culture and trying to understand their unspoken practices. So the term for this is called enculturation. And if I were to define enculturation, basically what this is learned behavior. You grow up learning gender roles. You grow up learning that in our society, for whatever reason, well, I say for whatever reason, it's historically based, boys are supposed to quote unquote wear blue and girls are supposed to quote unquote wear pink. This is learned behavior. There's nothing that triggers in your mind when you were born that says, okay, you are a boy, you must wear blue. A lot of individuals now are trying to find ways to counter this narrative, putting biological males as infants in gender-neutral coloring, as an example, or vice versa for biological females. But I'm going off track. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that enculturation is something that you just learn. It's like learning a language when you are growing up. There's nothing in your mind that says you are born in the US. You automatically know English. It's the same thing with culture. There's nothing that triggers in your mind when you were born that says, okay, this is how you drive a car. This is how you go to school. This is how you sit at a desk and wait for the instructor to start talking. This is all learned behavior. That's what culture is. But the learning takes place in a social environment with other people. I mention this because cultural relativism is about understanding a group's beliefs and practices within their own cultural context without making judgments. Context is a huge word in anthropology and also a huge word in understanding cultural relativism. Individuals have grown up in a different environment than you have. This is going to shape their understanding of the world, what they understand to be a taboo, what they understand to be the norm, what you should do. And when you learn what the norm is, you learn what is not the norm, what is the other, what is wrong, essentially. With that being said, once you understand that everything is a learned behavior, you have a better idea of how to not make a judgment on the individual based on their cultural understandings and practices. This is not to say that every practice, from a human rights perspective, for instance, is inherently good. It's just a practice. There's nothing inherently good, inherently bad about a practice. However, from a human rights perspective, or a, let's say, gender power perspective in terms of feminism, there are some things that you can disagree with. I'm not saying you can't disagree with anything I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that there's nothing inherently bad or good about a cultural practice. It's just a part of that culture. However, this is really hard to do, especially when you have ingrained opinions that you have learned over time. So anthropology, this is not something that I could even say universally, but the majority of cultural anthropologists say we can never be completely objective. Objectivity as a term is a myth. What I mean by that is that we are people, as a researcher, as a student, and we are inherently biased towards certain things. We inherently think that some things are good and some things are bad. However, if we reflect on our upbringing, on our enculturation over time, we can take a step back and say, okay, I am biased, and now here's how I can acknowledge my bias and make sure that it does not get in the way of me doing good research or my ability to speak with other people, as an example. Everyone has unspoken biases. You will find them in research, and when I say find them, they're unspoken, so they're not present. This is why it is important that you critically read everything that you have in front of you. Additionally, apply that to everything you hear and everything you see, because you don't know the intentions of the author if they don't make them explicit. So many anthropologists and many, for instance, feminist scholars and other disciplines that are more reflexive will have a bias, basically, section in their work that says, okay, as an example of my own, I am a cisgendered, white, male, straight researcher in the United States from a position of privilege. This is going to inherently bias my understanding of the world and also make it difficult for me to enter certain spaces, which is going to shape my ability to say this is generalizable information. So when I'm doing work in Belize on the Zika virus as both a mosquito-borne infectious disease, but also a disease that can be spread sexually, I have a much easier time talking with men than I do women, just because I myself am a cisgendered man. That doesn't mean I can't talk with women or biological females about their experiences, which are very distinct and different from a man's or biological male's experiences with Zika virus, as a disease that also can impact reproduction, let's say of microcephaly of the fetus. But I'm going to get different answers than, let's say, a female scholar entering the field and looking at a similar topic. She may have a harder time talking about sexual practices and condom use with men than she would have speaking with women about pregnancy concerns because of Zika virus. It's different information. One's not inherently worse than the other. You're asking different questions, and you have different answers available to you. Why I'm bringing this up in terms of cultural relativism is that this also applies to our interactions on a daily basis. It is easier for men to talk in so-called male spaces than it is for a woman to enter this space. And let's say she does enter such a space, there are going to be some unspoken underlying biases that shape how that individual is interacted with and communicated with, despite a person's best interest in, for instance, trying to be as equitable as possible. It's just baked into our learned behavior. We can try to unlearn that behavior. It's really hard because it's something that we are enculturated in over time. It's possible. It's just hard. Anthropology is hard to do right. It's very easy to do poorly, which is why I'm stressing that you critically read all the material that I'm providing you so that you can make your own assumptions. You can make your own stance on the perspective of the researcher. And if there's anything that, for instance, you think that they did wrong or could do better. Because anthropology is an iterative process. You read an article and you say, hey, this is pretty interesting, but I think they're missing X, Y, or Z. If I did this, I could expand upon this. Let's say, write an article. It enters the discipline, people start citing it and reading it, and now you have changed the discipline. It's the same thing with cultural practices. If there's something that you don't agree with, If you are making enough noise, you may start to, over time, shape what we understand to be behavior that is acceptable, and also behavior what is not acceptable, what is taboo, what is something that you don't do in a certain culture. For instance, this is why it's very important for you to be outspoken against racism, against sexism, among other isms, because collectively we can make a change. It's just really hard to do so, especially if people feel that they shouldn't say something because it makes them uncomfortable, as an example. It has also been argued, rightfully to some extent, that you can take cultural relativism too far. There are some critiques of this stance, which in part is due to people misunderstanding what is meant when you should take a cultural relativist perspective, and others rightfully pointing out that sometimes there are some practices that do violate human rights and/or ethics as they are largely understood, because this is also not something that is a universal thing. Human rights itself is also a very contentious statement because you have likely a different definition of what that means than someone else, despite us having this assumption that we have these sort of ingrained about us. So, for example, there are those that take a human rights perspective that say that individuals that would wish to seek an abortion should have the bodily autonomy to do so as a human being. On the flip side of that, human rights has been used for anti-abortion activists that say you are violating the human rights of the fetus or the infant that would later develop. So I lean towards bodily autonomy, but not everyone does. So you have to be careful when you use a framework such as human rights, because there may be a widely accepted definition of what that means, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to accept it. On that note, you don't necessarily have to accept, in terms of your own morality or sense of judgment and ethics, a cultural practice that you are seeing. However, again, culture just is there. There's nothing inherently bad or good about it. It just exists to an anthropologist. You can then start to make value statements after you understand the cultural context to advocate for, let's say, the reduction of female genital cutting, as it has been termed, basically circumcision in different forms of the female reproductive system. When I say that, however, it is also important to note that the term even female genital cutting is in response to a cultural relativist perspective. When this was first talked about in scholarship, it often was referred to as female genital mutilation. Saying mutilation carries with it a lot of extra stigma, essentially. And it was argued largely by anthropologists that were critiquing those calling it mutilation, that to the culture that is practicing this, it is not mutilation. We are seeing a cultural practice that is long ingrained in its history and is understood as a good thing, despite you understanding that there are some human rights, at least complications, that can arise due to this practice. And additionally, also public health consequences that can arise due to this practice. So from a public health perspective, you can say female genital cutting or mutilation, FGM, is negative in terms of population health and individual health. From a cultural relativist perspective, you can still say, I understand that, but this is also the cultural practice that we are seeing. So we can better understand it by not just out from the get-go saying this is bad, essentially. Does that make sense? If not, let me know. This is where it starts to get a little murky in terms of taking cultural relativism either too far or having a very soft approach to it on the flip side. Most anthropologists now, in response to critiques such as this, take a more middle ground approach where they say, we understand this is a cultural practice, however, we do have some qualms about it because of, let's say, population health or bodily autonomy of young females kind of just having to do this practice so that they aren't stigmatized or shunned from their communities. So that's human rights and ethics sort of mixed in with cultural relativism. Anthropology can get very messy because humans are just very messy species, essentially. So keep that in mind as you are sort of thinking about the Abu Lughod reading, because I am touching on a lot of themes here that kind of follow into that discussion as well. Additionally, when we're talking about cultures in this class, this is something that I want you to really understand. Culture is not something that is static or monolithic. Culture in Florida could be very different from culture in Alaska. We can say there is a general American culture, and there probably are some general themes of what that means, but there is no one thing that every person from the United States does. There is no one American culture. And also, me saying American is problematic, because those that live, let's say, in Costa Rica or Belize or Colombia technically are also living in America. So when I'm saying America, no, it is shorthand for me saying someone from the United States. But in your writing, try to avoid saying American culture, because of the implications basically saying they are not American, we are American. Does that make sense? A lot of people actually get very angry about this when people from the US say that they are American, or you are from America, because so are they. They're from Latin America or somewhere else, such as Canada, or you get the idea. So in terms of globalization, there's another aspect here that you need to sort of think about, and that is cultures are constantly mixing, especially nowadays with the advent of technology and travel methods. Less so because everyone's stuck at home because of COVID for the most part, but just know that, let's say you have something that you're just calling American culture or culture from the United States. As soon as it comes in contact with another culture, there's going to be an exchange of ideas. Remember the Creolization? This happens not just with food, but also with cultural practices, religious practices which fall within cultural practices. It just gets really complicated and messy, and it's problematic to say that this is what this culture is. That's how anthropology used to do it. This is the Noir culture, or this is Colombian culture. There's too much regional variance and intermixing of ideas and belief systems to really say there is a generalized one culture, basically. When I'm saying that culture is not static, that means culture in the US probably looked different 100 years ago, you could probably say, yes, compared to today. Cultures change. We don't say they evolve, because evolve from a genetic perspective usually means that they are progressing towards something in terms of Darwinian evolutionism, which is a social construct individuals can rightly critique. On that note, since I'm already kind of dipping into this tangent, evolution, biological evolution, is not progressing towards something. It's just evolving. It's mutations that are largely random that may be adapted over time due to their viability in the environment. When someone's talking about cultural evolution, however, there is an implication that that cultures are somehow progressing towards a greater form of being. This has been largely critiqued by anthropologists primarily, who say that cultures just change. Mutations, if you want to use that word, doesn't imply it is better than the previous version. It just changed, essentially. So keep that in mind when you are thinking about cultures in terms of they are more primitive or less primitive than your own, because that really isn't the case. People are naturally complex beings, and so is culture as a product that we create and participate in. I'm looking forward to reading your reflections on this, because the question that I pose at the very top here, what is the point of this article, can develop into different answers depending on your own perspective when you're reading the piece. For instance, one thing that Abu Lughod raises is the question I have here at the bottom. The question is why knowing about the culture of the region, and particularly its religious beliefs and the treatment of women, was more urgent than exploring the history of the development of repressive regimes in the region and the US role in this history. What the author is saying here is that, especially in the wake of 9/11, there was this perception that we needed to go there and save women largely from men. The subcontext here is that we are trying to save brown women from brown men. And by we, I mean white women or white men from the United States. There is a long history of this in terms of colonialism where we are somehow doing them a favor by occupying and colonizing them. We are giving them education, we are giving them democracy in the terms of the US expansionism, and that they should just accept this because they will have a better life as a result. With the caveat that we barely ever ask them if they even want that to happen. When we were talking about veiling or the burqa, for instance, there was an assumption from a feminist perspective. And when I say feminist, I largely mean Western feminist perspective, that wearing a veil or wearing a burqa or covering oneself was a product of male domination of the female body and their bodily autonomy. However, feminists and women in the Middle East may have a different perspective towards that. They may be wearing the covering as a cultural practice for cultural reasons that are historically mediated. That being said, the veil itself and the supposed oppression of women, not to say that that does not happen in the Middle East, in certain countries, has been used by the United States to justify our occupation in the Middle East. Abu Lughod says we need to be critical about our role in this discussion and also how potentially we may be using a cultural practice that we judge as inferior to our own from an ethnocentric perspective as a means to occupy and maybe even in a different way enact our own form of repression in said countries. Continuing this thought further, the author argues it should be recalled that the Taliban did not invent the burqa, especially when these are forms of dress that had become so conventional that most women gave little thought to their meaning. Let's break this down. And I think that if you have been paying attention, some of these themes may start to be bleeding in from my earlier discussion. As the author says, the burqa, in a sense, is a mobile home for the woman that is wearing it. She is expressing her understanding of modesty and being a member of her community and being a member of her family by wearing one. And when I'm saying this, also keep in mind that, of course, not everyone is going to agree with this, both in the context of the United States or in the Middle East or elsewhere. But generally, as a sort of cultural construct and idea of the burqa, this is generally what the author is finding and is generally what women that are arguing that they should be able to wear coverings and veils are saying. So there's this culturally baked idea about what it means to wear a burqa that from a ethnocentric Western perspective may simply have just been seen as women that are being oppressed and forced to cover themselves. So, with that in mind, there are some words here that are also key to hone in on. The author says, had become so conventional. Conventional is the key word here. You can think of conventional as what I'm talking about when I say unspoken. It's just something that you just grow up to accept implicitly without really thinking about it. When you are growing up as a child in the US or elsewhere, there are certain clothes that, let's say, that your parents or guardians bought for you. You're not really putting a whole lot of thought process into, okay, why am I wearing this? You just know that you should be wearing it. It's the same thing in this case, and perhaps even more so because it is tied to religious and historical understandings of, let's say, modesty for women's dress in the Middle East, which is a construct itself that in the United States we've also experienced, of course, throughout time. For instance, women in the US at one point were judged for showing their ankles or wearing bikinis. But culture changes over time. Again, doesn't get better, it just changes. But some practices are very much rooted within the larger cultural system, and they may not see a whole lot of change over time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just is. So, you have people wearing a burqa because they just know that they basically should, without really thinking about the why to that, unless they are asked the question of that is, why are you wearing this? And this gets to a concept in anthropology and also linguistics called habitus. And habitus basically is learned behavior that you just accept as your reality. When you are talking to an adult, let's say a very elderly person, you probably give them more deference than someone that is your peer, that you are a friend with. This is not something that you are expected to be told to do all the time. You just are expected to do it. And there could be consequences for not doing this. So for instance, in that scenario, you may be judged as being disrespectful. Whether or not you are is a different story, but there is a perception or expectation that you should give deference to elderly individuals because of our understandings of the lived experience over time, and that these individuals should be respected, essentially. So, with that being said, you can really apply this to every cultural practice. And another term that is tied to habitus is called bodily hexis. Basically, it's habitus for what you're wearing. In the United States, there are some clothes, this is changing over time, but generally are reserved for men's attire or women's attire. By that I mean, it may have been strange 50 years ago, again, using this example, actually probably longer now because jeans have been around for a long time, probably has to say 80 or so years ago at this point, that it was still kind of weird to see women wearing jeans. Nowadays, it's very much an accepted and sort of expected practice, but it still would be weird if you saw someone wearing jeans in an earlier period of time, because it was considered to be male clothing or men's clothing. That being said, in this scenario, it probably would be strange for someone to see a man wearing a full veil or a burqa. There are clothes that you just sort of implicitly know, based on cultural ideas, nothing in your biology, this is supposed to be what I should wear, basically. So, why are we surprised that Afghan women do not throw off their burqas when we know perfectly well that it would not be appropriate to wear shorts to the opera? What the author is saying here is that certain clothing is right for certain contexts. You're not going to be wearing swim trunks when you go to the movie theater, probably. I don't know your life. But you wear different clothing depending on where you are in your environment. And in the instance of the article, it is generally accepted and expected, especially, that women wear burqas when they are out in public for a variety of different culturally understood and mediated reasons. The YouTube link that I have here is a short description of a lot of the themes that we just talked about. So take a minute or two to watch this and to sort of process what the individual is saying also too when they are talking about these topics. All right, the last slide, we all made it. We're going to cover one more concept here that we're going to use throughout the semester that the article touches on, and that is agency. So, as the author says, veiling, so covering oneself, itself must not be confused with or made to stand for a lack of agency. So we'll revisit that in a second. So in the meantime, let's go to a definition of agency, which I have defined as the ability to act independently within your environment, which is influenced by sociocultural and political economic structures. So let's break that definition down. When I'm saying act independently, what that really means is you have the capacity to do basically whatever you want. There's going to be consequences to that are culturally mediated, which is the sociocultural concept that is embedded within this definition, and also mediated by the structures around you, whether that be the political structures or the economic structures. For instance, I'm operating on a teaching assistant salary, so I probably can't afford a yacht. That is something that is probably outside of my agency, despite my want to buy a yacht. I don't really want a yacht, they sound like a lot of work, but what I'm trying to say basically is there are some things that you just can't do, so your agency is limited in some capacity when it comes to doing that, which is tied to your economic capital. And there are other forms of capital we'll get into later, but basically, if you don't have enough money to buy a certain service, you just don't have access to that service. Another example of agency, which you can really think of as basically free will, like in a Judeo-Christian concept, like you have the ability to do whatever you want, but again, there's going to be consequences to that action potentially. I could walk across the streets, even though I know there's a law that says don't jaywalk, and I also know that if I do that, I may get hit by a car. But I have the ability to make that conscious decision to walk across the street. I have the agency to do so. What the author is saying here is that veiling should not be confused as a lack of agency, meaning from a Western feminist perspective, you may see veiling as the oppression of women because they are basically constrained into how they can express themselves physically with their bodies. However, that is an assumption that is not cognizant of cultural understandings of the practice of wearing a veil and the reasons for doing so. You may find individuals in countries or in areas that do practice veiling that say, yes, I do feel like I'm oppressed. But you may also find individuals that say, no, this is an expression of my modesty, of my embeddedness within family value systems in my country. So there are different understandings of different practices that are not always going to be uniform. And in fact, many things do not have a uniform perception towards them. People have different perceptions towards everything because humans, again, are messy, irrational creatures. And we'll get into rationality versus irrationality also later. But just know that anthropology generally says that humans don't always act what we consider to be rational. And by saying there is a thing called rational behavior, that also itself is an ethnocentric perception because it is based on your biases of what someone should or should not do. So going off of that, and hopefully I've not confused you, again, if I have, please feel free to reach out to me. Basically what agency is your ability to act regardless of potential consequences. You just have the ability to do so. I, for instance, could just throw a pencil on the ground with no rhyme or reason to it just because I have the ability to do so. So the author goes on to say, what does freedom mean if we accept the fundamental premise that humans are social beings, which I've highlighted here, always raised in certain social and historical contexts and belonging to particular communities that shape their desires and understandings of the world? This very long sentence is what I'm trying to get at when I say enculturation. These are all learned behaviors that you, over time, come to accept without really thinking about it. You don't actively wake up in the day and say, hey, why am I wearing a veil? You just know that you are, in a sense, supposed to wear a veil as a member that is participating within your culture or your society. That is how anthropology understands ritual behavior, again, just meaning behavior that is repetitive over time, that we just do for X, Y, and Z reasons, and also how we understand culture as something that is a learned behavior that we enact in a group setting, both participating in, reifying, and changing culture over time during those interactions. All right, I lied. There is one very short slide, this one, and then you are done. Just so you know what is happening next week, we will be talking about biological sex, gender as a social construct, which are distinct terms, and also sexuality. Of course, this is a huge topic, and the holiday that is coming up gives us a shortened period of time to talk about it. Seeing as that holiday falls on one of our class sessions, I do not want to make you basically have to listen to an extra lecture. So given that concession, make sure that you watch the documentary that I have here at the bottom as well. It is incredibly important as a foundational film for you to understand some of these concepts in greater detail at least. Now, on that note, I will be engaging with biological sex, gender, and sexuality really throughout the semester. And you can start to think about next week as the start of the more anthropological discussions that we are going to have in terms of the readings, documentaries, and podcasts. Once we go over biological sex, gender, and sexuality, we will start to go into other intersectional topics, which I will get into later on, including race and ethnicity. and how these two concepts, or weeks basically, fit together to give you a larger picture of the human condition, at least in the United States.